There's a photograph from North Africa, 1942. A cluster of German tankers, dusty and sunburned, standing beside a captured American M3 Stuart light tank. They're smiling. One of them has his boot propped up on the thin hull like it's a hunting trophy. Another is pointing at the small 37mm gun barrel, shaking his head as if to say, "This? This is what they sent." The Germans had a nickname for it. Sardenenbuchse. Sardine can. To panzer crews accustomed to the angular brutality of their own machines, the Panzer III with its layered steel and dignified Teutonic engineering, the Stuart looked absurd. It was light. It was loud. It rattled when it moved. Its armor was thin enough that you could almost believe a determined man with a hammer might punch through. In letters home, German tank commanders wrote with bemused condescension about the American toy tank, the little machine that seemed more suited to a parade ground than the savage mathematics of tank versus tank warfare. But here's what those photographs don't show. They don't show the American crews who climbed into those same Stuarts every morning, knowing exactly what their machine was, and what it wasn't. They didn't need propaganda to tell them the Stuart couldn't win a slugfest. They already knew. What they also knew, and what the Germans were about to learn the hard way, was that the Stuart was never designed to stand and fight. It was designed to run. To see. To speak. And in doing so, it would rewrite the rules of armored warfare in the desert, in the bocage, in the Pacific mud, everywhere it went. The tank the Germans mocked would become the tank they learned to fear. Not because of what it could do to them directly, but because of what it could make happen to them. The reversal was already in motion. The Germans just hadn't noticed yet. To understand why the Stuart existed at all, you have to go back to a different America. The 1930s. A country still haunted by the trenches of the last war, skeptical of heavy armor, and deeply influenced by the US cavalry, yes, the horse cavalry, which was desperately trying to justify its existence in an age of engines and steel. The cavalry didn't want a tank that would slug it out with enemy heavyweights. They wanted something that could do what cavalry had always done: scout ahead, probe the enemy, find the gaps, and report back. Speed was sacred. Agility was doctrine. The Stuart wasn't a mistake or a compromise born from industrial weakness. It was a philosophy on tracks. American engineers took that philosophy seriously. They gave the Stuart a radial engine borrowed from aircraft design, the Continental R975, air-cooled, 7 cylinders arranged in a star. It screamed when it ran. It guzzled high-octane aviation gasoline. And it could push the 13-ton machine to speeds the Germans would find difficult to believe. The hull was welded, not riveted. Streamlined. Light. The turret could traverse fast. The suspension, a vertical volute spring, was designed to keep the tank stable even at full sprint across uneven ground. Everything about the Stuart's design prioritized one thing: don't be where the enemy expects you to be. The Germans misunderstood this completely. They looked at the Stuart and saw a tank that had failed to meet their own standards. They saw thin armor and a small gun and concluded the Americans didn't know how to build real fighting vehicles. What they failed to grasp was that the Americans had built exactly what they intended to build. A racehorse. Not a warhorse. And there was one more thing, something the Germans would take far too long to appreciate. Every single Stuart rolled off the assembly line with a radio. Not just a receiver for orders from a distant commander, but a transmitter. A voice. The ability to speak to other tanks, to artillery, to aircraft, to the entire interlocking web of American combined arms doctrine. The Stuart wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to see, to move, and to tell. And in the deserts of North Africa, that combination was about to become lethal. The first encounters were almost comedic in their imbalance of expectations. North Africa, early 1942. The Afrika Korps had been in the desert for over a year, battle-hardened, confident, led by Rommel himself. They had faced British Matildas, Crusaders, Valentines. They knew what enemy armor looked like. Then the Americans arrived. Green. Untested. And driving these things. One Panzer III commander, writing home to his wife in Bavaria, described his first sighting of a Stuart column. They clatter across the sand like farm tractors, thin as tin, fast as rabbits. One good shot and they will crumple. Another officer, in a report later captured by British intelligence, noted with aristocratic disdain that the American light tank appears designed for show, not war. There were even instances, documented in unit diaries, of German tank crews not firing at Stuarts during early skirmishes, dismissing them as unworthy targets. "Let the anti-tank guns deal with them," one platoon leader reportedly said. "We hunt real tanks." This wasn't mere bravado. It was cultural. The German armored corps had a self-image rooted in disciplined lethality, in the blitzkrieg myth, in machines like the Panzerf that could stand toe-to-toe with anything the Soviets fielded. To be challenged by something that weighed less than half what a Panzer III did, that looked like it belonged in a training depot, it was insulting. The mockery was genuine. The arrogance was real. And for a few weeks, it seemed justified. Stuarts did get knocked out. Their armor couldn't stop much. A well-placed 50mm round from a Panzer III could punch clean through. In stand-up fights, the Stuart lost. But here's what the Germans didn't notice in those early weeks. The Stuarts weren't standing up. They weren't trying to duel. And every time a Stuart appeared, dashed across an open ridgeline, and vanished behind a dune or a rocky outcrop, something else happened. Something the Germans wouldn't connect to the Stuart for a dangerously long time. Artillery would start falling. Anti-tank guns would reposition. Entire German columns would find themselves suddenly under flanking fire from positions they thought were empty. The Stuart wasn't the predator. It was the spotter. The messenger. The eyes of a beast the Germans couldn't yet see. And by the time they understood, it would be too late to laugh. Let's be clear about what the Stuart could do with its 37mm gun. Against early Panzer IIIs, at close range, from the side or rear, it could penetrate. It could kill. American crews did score kills. But those were opportunistic, desperate, or brilliant depending on who's telling the story. They were never the plan. The plan was something the Germans had no frame of reference for. Picture it from the Stuart crew's perspective. You're moving fast, faster than anything the enemy has on tracks. Your commander is scanning with binoculars, the turret traversing smoothly. You crest a ridgeline. There, 2 kilometers out, you spot them, a column of German armor moving through a wadi, kicking up dust, unaware. You don't charge. You don't engage. You radio. Contact. Grid reference for -7-2-3-9-8. Enemy armor, estimated 8 vehicles, heading northwest. Over. Then you vanish. Back behind the ridge, throttle open, engine howling. By the time the Germans even know you were there, you're a kilometer away. And 60 seconds later, the artillery starts falling. American 105mm howitzers, pre-sighted, guided by your coordinates. The German column doesn't see the Stuart again. They don't need to. The damage is done. This was the kill chain. Dash. Spot. Report. Withdraw. Repeat. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make for dramatic one-on-one tank duels. But it was brutally, mathematically effective. And it exploited a vulnerability the Germans didn't even realize they had. Most German tanks in 1942 North Africa did not have radios between vehicles. A panzer platoon might have one radio in the command tank, but the others relied on hand signals, flags, or simply following the leader. They were coordinated by sight, not by voice. When a Stuart disappeared, the Germans had no fast way to warn other units, no way to call in their own fire support against a target they'd only glimpsed for seconds. Meanwhile, every Stuart could talk to every other Stuart. To infantry. To artillery observers. To air support. The American battle space was networked. The Stuart wasn't a lone fighter. It was a node in a system. And the system was learning. With every scouting run, American crews refined their tactics. They learned the range at which German guns could reliably hit a moving target and stayed just outside it. They learned the terrain that gave them cover. They learned to bait pursuit, then lead panzers into prepositioned ambushes. The Stuart's real weapon wasn't steel. It was information. And the Germans were hemorrhaging it without even knowing. Let's talk numbers. Real numbers. The kind logged in after action reports and technical evaluations. The M3 Stuart, under ideal conditions, could reach 36 miles per hour on flat ground. Loaded with fuel, ammo, and a 4-man crew, it could sustain 30 miles per hour for extended runs. The Panzer III, by contrast, maxed out around 25 miles per hour on roads, and closer to 15 to 18 miles per hour across rough desert terrain. That might not sound like much. 9, maybe 12 miles per hour difference. But in the compressed time frame of tank combat, where engagement windows are measured in seconds, it was everything. Here's how it played out. A panzer commander spots a Stuart at 1,200 meters. He gives the order. The gunner traverses the turret, tracks the target. The Stuart is moving laterally, kicking up dust. The gunner estimates lead, adjusts for range. He fires. The 50mm round screams downrange at roughly 835 meters per second. Flight time, just over 1 second. In that 1 second, at 30 miles per hour, the Stuart has moved 14 meters. Miss. The gunner adjusts. Fires again. But now the Stuart isn't moving laterally anymore. It's angling away, presenting an even narrower profile, accelerating. The next shot misses wide. And by the time the third shot is loaded, the Stuart has crested a rise and vanished. German gunnery logs from Tunisia, captured in 1943, show a pattern. Engagement success rates against moving Stuarts at ranges beyond 800 meters were abysmal, often below 15%. One frustrated panzer officer wrote in his war diary, "The American reconnaissance tanks refuse to sit still. Our guns are accurate. Our crews are trained. But we cannot hit phantoms." Phantoms. That's what the Stuart had become. And it wasn't just speed in a straight line. The Stuart's suspension allowed it to maintain speed over broken ground where panzers had to slow down or risk throwing a track. Its low weight meant it could cross softs and that would bog down heavier German machines. In the bocage of Normandy, it could slip through narrow farm lanes. In the Pacific, it could navigate jungle trails that weren't even roads. American combat reports from Operation Torch include accounts of Stuarts literally running circles around German defensive positions, drawing fire, then disappearing before the Germans could coordinate a response. One report from the 1st Armored Division noted, enemy unable to effectively engage reconnaissance elements due to speed differential. Losses minimal. Intelligence gathered, extensive. Speed wasn't just an advantage. It was armor. The best armor the Stuart had. And the Germans, who had built their doctrine around the idea that superior firepower and positioning would decide tank battles, were discovering that sometimes the tank you can't hit doesn't need thick steel at all. But speed alone doesn't kill tanks. What happened after the Stuart disappeared? That's where the real carnage began. Imagine you're a panzer crew. You've just spent 5 minutes trying to hit a single American light tank that appeared on your flank, fired a few rounds that pinged harmlessly off your armor, then vanished. It was irritating, but not dangerous. You report it up the chain. Your platoon repositions slightly. You keep moving. Then, 8 minutes later, the world explodes. Artillery. Not random. Not harassing fire. Precise. Concentrated. Shells landing among your column with terrifying accuracy. One panzer takes a direct hit on the engine deck and starts burning. Another throws a track trying to evade. Your commander is shouting into the radio, trying to coordinate a withdrawal, but the shells keep coming. You never see the Stuart again. You don't connect it to the hell that's raining down on you. But the Stuart crew does. They're 3 kilometers away now, hull down behind a ridge, watching the smoke rise. Their radio operator is still on the net, adjusting fire. Drop 50, left 20. Fire for effect. This was the revolution the Germans didn't anticipate. The Stuart wasn't hunting panzers. It was marking them. It turned German armor into coordinates. And American doctrine turned coordinates into wreckage. Every Stuart had an SCR 508 or SCR 528 radio, reliable, frequency hopping, with a range of up to 20 miles depending on terrain. They could reach artillery batteries, forward observers, fighter bombers. The entire American war machine could be summoned by a single Stuart that glimpsed the enemy for 30 seconds. German tankers began to realize this, slowly, bitterly. In debriefs after the battles in Tunisia, captured officers expressed bewilderment at how American artillery seemed to find them so quickly, so often. "We are under fire before we even see the enemy," one report stated. "Their reconnaissance is invisible. Their coordination is instant." What the Germans were experiencing was the death of the old armored warfare. The kind where tanks fought tanks, where the better gun and thicker armor won. The Stuart didn't fight that war. It fought a war of systems, of networks, of combined arms so tightly integrated that a light tank with a popgun became the most dangerous piece on the board, not because of what it was, but because of what it enabled. There are accounts from Kasserine Pass, from Sicily, from the hedgerows of France, of German tank commanders ordering their crews not to chase Stuarts. "They are bait," one standing order read. "Engaging them only reveals your position." The tank they mocked had become the tank they feared. Not because it could kill them, though sometimes it did, but because it could summon death from beyond the horizon. And once the Stuart saw you, there was nowhere to hide. The psychological shift didn't happen all at once. It crept through the German armored corps like a slow, cold realization. By late 1942, the tone in German unit diaries and after-action reports had changed. The mockery was gone. In its place, frustration, confusion, and something close to dread. "Do not pursue American light tanks," one directive from a panzer regiment in Tunisia read. "They will lead you into prepared positions." Another, from Sicily, "The enemy reconnaissance armor operates in coordinated groups. Engaging one alerts the others. Expect artillery." The Stuart had done something extraordinary. It had changed German doctrine. Not through brute force, but through sheer operational frustration. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Poland in weeks and France in 6, was now issuing orders to its elite tank crews to avoid a tank they'd once dismissed as beneath notice. There are stories, anecdotal, but repeated across memoirs and interviews, of panzer crews in Normandy who would spot Stuarts and immediately reverse course. Not because they feared the Stuart itself, but because they knew what it meant. They knew the chain reaction it could trigger. One veteran, interviewed decades later, said it plainly: "When you saw the little American tank, you knew you had been seen. And that was worse than being shot at." The tables had completely turned. The hunter had become the hunted. German crews, who had rolled into battle with swagger and certainty, were now hesitant. Paranoid. Constantly scanning not for threats they could fight, but for threats they couldn't catch. And the Americans noticed. Stuart crews began to exploit this psychological edge. They would deliberately show themselves, knowing the Germans would hesitate or withdraw. They would feint attacks, drawing enemy forces into kill zones. They became bullies, not because they were stronger, but because the Germans had learned to fear what came after. There's a particular kind of humiliation in being beaten by something you don't respect. The Germans had respected the Soviet Tu-34. They'd respected the British Churchill. Those were machines that could hurt you directly, immediately. But the Stuart? It was still light. Still thin-skinned. Still, by every traditional measure, inferior. And yet, it had won. Not by playing the Germans' game, but by refusing to. By rewriting the rules. By turning speed, coordination, and information into weapons as deadly as any cannon. The moment everything flipped wasn't a single battle. It was 1,000 small realizations across 100 battlefields. The moment when a panzer commander, staring at a distant dust cloud, decided it wasn't worth the risk. The moment when survival meant running from a sardine can. The M3 Stuart was never the best tank of World War II. It wasn't the most heavily armed. It wasn't the most feared in single combat. By 1943, it was already being supplemented and replaced by newer designs, the M5 Stuart, then the M24 Chaffee, as American doctrine evolved and lessons were absorbed. But the Stuart might be the most important tank of the war that nobody talks about. Because what the Stuart did, what it proved, was that the old rules were dead. Tank warfare was no longer just about armor and firepower. It was about speed, coordination, and the integration of information across the battlefield. The Stuart was the first tank truly designed for the radio age. The first to weaponize mobility not as a means of retreat, but as a deliberate, offensive tool. It taught the Americans how to fight. In North Africa, the US armored forces were inexperienced, outmatched, and blooded. But the Stuart crews learned fast. They developed tactics that would define American armor doctrine for generations: aggressive reconnaissance, combined arms integration, the use of speed and communication to create operational advantages. The Stuart was the classroom. It taught the Germans to adapt. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered blitzkrieg and armored warfare in the modern sense, was forced to rethink its own principles. The introduction of more radios in German tanks, the emphasis on anti-tank screens, the doctrinal caution around light armor, all of it was a response to what the Stuart had done to them. And it taught the world a lesson that would echo into the Cold War and beyond. That the deadliest weapon on a modern battlefield isn't always the one with the biggest gun. Sometimes it's the one that sees first. The one that communicates fastest. The one that turns the enemy's strength into a liability by never giving them a target worth shooting at. The irony is almost poetic. The tank that Germany mocked, the tank that looked like a toy, the sardine can that couldn't win a fair fight, it was the tank that rewired how armored warfare was fought. It was the vanguard of a new kind of war, where information dominance mattered as much as steel. Today, the Stuart is a footnote in most histories. A transitional design. A stopgap. But walk through the wreckage of North Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy, the jungles of the Pacific, and you'll see its ghost everywhere. In the doctrine. In the tactics. In the very language of modern mechanized warfare. The Germans laughed at the Stuart. Then they chased it. Then they ran from it. And in the end, it didn't matter how thick their armor was or how powerful their guns were. Because the Stuart was never there to fight them. It was there to end them. And it did.